1969. Airports in that era weren't the polished, silent corridors they are today. They were louder, tighter, filled with cigarette smoke, echoing announcements, and the restless energy of people standing too close to one another with nothing to do but wait. Bruce Lee stood near a departure gate, dressed simply, carrying no entourage, no aura of celebrity beyond the posture and presence that made people look twice without knowing why. He wasn't in a hurry. He never rushed when stillness was required. To Bruce, waiting was just another state of readiness. A few rows away stood a tall man, easily 6 feet, broad-shouldered, confident in the quiet way that comes from years of physical dominance rather than performance. He wore the relaxed arrogance of someone used to being the biggest person in the room, the kind of man whose body had solved most problems for him long before words were needed. The patches on his bag and the way he carried himself made it clear to anyone who knew combat sports what he was: a judo black belt, seasoned, strong, proud of a system that emphasized leverage, throws, and control over theatrics. The comment wasn't aimed at Bruce at first. It was tossed into the air. "Kung Fu is useless," the man said with a half smile, loud enough to be heard, quiet enough to pretend it wasn't directed at anyone in particular. "All that fancy movement. Try it on someone who actually knows how to fight." A few people laughed nervously. Others pretended not to hear. Airports have a way of turning tension invisible because no one wants to be involved. Bruce heard it. He always did. But he didn't turn immediately. He didn't react the way people expected someone like him to react. He let the words settle, measured the intent behind them, the way a fighter measures distance before committing. The judo practitioner noticed him then. "Nice the stillness, nice the build. You," he said, nodding toward Bruce now, curiosity mixing with challenge. "You do Kung Fu, right?" Bruce turned slowly, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge the question. His face was calm, almost neutral, the way it was when he was more interested in information than confrontation. He didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it with pride. He simply said yes. The man smirked. "Figures. Look, no disrespect," he said, already disrespecting him. "But in real life, Kung Fu doesn't work. Too slow. Too pretty. One grab and it's over." Bruce didn't argue. That was the first surprise. He didn't defend Kung Fu. He didn't name styles. He didn't recite philosophy. He asked a single question instead, softly enough that the man leaned in to hear it. "What do you mean by real life?" The judo black belt laughed. "I mean this," he said, stepping closer, invading space slightly, the way grapplers do when they want to establish physical conversation. No rules, no forms, no movies. 7 seconds. That's how long it took from the moment the man shifted his weight forward to the moment his certainty collapsed. Bruce didn't strike first. He didn't throw a punch. He moved. As the judo practitioner reached instinctively, hands coming up to clinch, Bruce adjusted his angle by inches, not feet, stepping just outside the line of force. His forearm intercepting not the grab, but the balance behind it. The movement was so small, most of the bystanders missed it entirely. What they saw was the result. The tall man suddenly weightless. Momentum stolen. Posture compromised before strength could be applied. Bruce guided him, not violently, not aggressively, redirecting the forward drive into emptiness. And in that gap, the man's center betrayed him. His feet scrambled for traction that wasn't there. Bruce didn't throw him hard. He didn't slam him. He placed him on the ground with enough clarity that resistance evaporated instantly. The sound wasn't dramatic. No crash, just a sharp exhale, as the man realized he was down. Bruce remained standing, balanced, hands open, eyes focused, not looming, not retreating, simply present. The entire exchange had taken less than 7 seconds, and in that time, the judo black belt had learned something no argument could have taught him. Technique doesn't announce itself, and effectiveness doesn't look like effort. People stared. Airports don't pause often, but that section did. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. A nearby attendant froze with a clipboard in hand. The man on the floor blinked, more confused than hurt, his mind racing to catch up with what his body already understood. He hadn't been overpowered. He hadn't been outmuscled. He had been displaced, dismantled, before strength became relevant. And he sang the lady's "Known Yourself." He knew his soul in just there. Bruce extended a hand, another surprise. The man hesitated, then took it. Bruce helped him up smoothly, making sure his balance was restored, making sure dignity returned with posture. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't explain what he'd done. He didn't lecture. He simply looked at the man and said something witnesses would later repeat in slightly different words, but always with the same meaning. "It's not about kung fu," Bruce said calmly. "It's about timing." The judo practitioner nodded, slowly, the smirk gone, replaced by something closer to respect. He didn't apologize. He didn't challenge again. He stepped back, adjusting his jacket, recalibrating not just his stance, but his assumptions. He takes off to the street of 40s last year. Bruce turned back toward his gate, as if nothing unusual had happened. That was the moment that stayed with people. Not the takedown, not the speed, the restraint. Bruce Lee didn't need to win a crowd. He didn't need to humiliate someone to make a point. He demonstrated a principle and disengaged. To him, the lesson was complete. The moment resistance dissolved. Anything beyond that would have been ego. Later, those who had seen it struggled to explain what they'd witnessed. Some said Bruce was unbelievably fast. Others said the judo black belt must have slipped. A few said it was luck. But the man himself knew better. He'd felt the moment his strength became irrelevant, the instant when his plan evaporated before it could even form. That kind of realization doesn't fade quickly. For Bruce, encounters like this weren't victories. They were confirmations. He believed deeply that style loyalty blinds people, that clinging to labels creates rigidity, and rigidity fails under pressure. The airport wasn't a dojo. It wasn't a ring. It was exactly the environment Bruce trained for. Unpredictable, crowded, constrained, real life. That's why he didn't argue when the man said Kung Fu was useless. Arguing wouldn't have revealed the flaw in that thinking. Experience did. 7 seconds was all it took to expose the gap between belief and reality. Bruce boarded his flight quietly. No one followed him. No one applauded. But the man he'd helped up didn't forget. Bruce boarded his flight quietly. Years later, he would tell the story differently than the witnesses. He wouldn't focus on being put down. He'd focus on how quickly his confidence dissolved, how easily assumptions failed, and how the calmest person in the room had controlled everything without aggression. That memory would change how he trained, how he approached strangers, how he spoke about other systems. Bruce Lee never claimed Kung Fu was superior. He claimed adaptability was. And in a noisy airport, in 7 silent seconds, that truth landed harder than any punch. After Bruce boarded the plane, the airport resumed its rhythm, but not its equilibrium. People returned to their seats. Attendants resumed announcements. Shoes squeaked against tile again. Yet something invisible had shifted, because those who had witnessed the exchange couldn't fit it neatly into the stories they already carried about fighting, strength, or dominance. It hadn't looked like a victory. It hadn't looked like a fight. It had looked like inevitability, and inevitability is harder to dismiss than spectacle. The judo black belt sat quietly for the rest of the wait. Posture different now, not slumped, but recalibrated, as if he were running the moment back in his mind, from multiple angles, trying to locate the instant where control slipped away. He wasn't embarrassed in the way people expect. He was unsettled in a deeper way. Embarrassment fades when you can blame circumstance. This couldn't be blamed. It had been clean, precise, undeniable. What struck him most wasn't that he'd been taken down. Grapplers get taken down. It was how little force had been involved. He'd trained for resistance, for struggle, for leverage battles that lasted seconds or minutes. What he encountered was absence, the absence of collision, the absence of effort. His strength had been invited forward and then abandoned mid-sentence, leaving him talking to empty space. That absence stayed with him. In the days that followed, he told the story carefully, not as a warning, but as a confession. He didn't exaggerate. If anything, he softened it, because exaggeration would have allowed listeners to file it away as entertainment. He emphasized the smallness of the movement, the way nothing dramatic seemed to happen until it was already over. Some laughed it off. Others leaned in. A few, quietly, started asking different questions about their own training. Bruce, meanwhile, never mentioned the incident. He didn't record it. He didn't recount it to students as proof of anything. For him, It was an ordinary confirmation of a principle he'd been testing for years. Airports, bars, hallways, narrow spaces, these were environments where formality dissolved and adaptability mattered. He trained for those spaces because life doesn't announce when it's about to test you. It just steps closer. The encounter reinforced Bruce's belief that labels create blind spots. The judo practitioner hadn't failed because judo was ineffective. He failed because he trusted the label more than the moment. Bruce had never trusted labels. He treated styles as languages, useful for communication, dangerous when mistaken for reality itself. Reality, in Bruce's mind, was always context dependent. And context doesn't care what you call yourself. This perspective shaped how Bruce taught afterward. He discouraged students from arguing about systems and encouraged them to argue with conditions instead. What happens when space is tight? What happens when footing is unstable? What happens when surprise collapses preparation? He forced students to train in street clothes, in confined spaces, under fatigue, not to glorify danger, but to remove illusions. He believed illusions get people hurt faster than ignorance. The airport incident also clarified something Bruce rarely said out loud. Control is a social responsibility. He could have injured the man. The opportunity had been there. The angle was there. The power was there. But Bruce chose resolution over demonstration. That choice wasn't mercy. It was discipline. He believed that causing unnecessary harm degrades the practitioner as much as the victim. The goal was not to dominate bodies, but to dissolve conflict. Alaya was taken from Mame. Those who trained closely with Bruce noticed that he emphasized disengagement as much as engagement. He taught how to enter decisively and exit cleanly without lingering. He warned that staying in a resolved situation invites new variables. End it. Leave. Let the lesson stand on its own. The airport was a perfect example. Once the point was made, Bruce disengaged and returned to waiting for his flight. Nothing more was needed. Years later, when stories like this circulated, critics often dismissed them as myths, arguing that no single movement could neutralize a trained grappler so quickly. Bruce would have agreed with part of that critique. He never claimed repeatable dominance in all conditions. He claimed probability. He claimed that timing, distance, and intent can create windows where outcomes compress. 7 seconds wasn't magic. It was the time it took for commitment to become vulnerability. The man Bruce encountered began training differently after that day. Not abandoning judo, but integrating awareness of initiation, of balance before contact, of how to protect centerline under surprise. He stopped mocking other systems. He stopped speaking in absolutes. He told students that any style becomes useless the moment it convinces you that others are. That humility didn't make him weaker. It made him harder to surprise. This is how Bruce Lee's influence often worked. It didn't convert people, it recalibrated them. He didn't ask others to adopt his language, he asked them to question their certainty. That questioning outlasted any technique he could have demonstrated. It spread quietly through changed training habits, altered conversations, softened arrogance. The airport incident also underscores a misunderstanding about Bruce's relationship with confrontation. He didn't seek it, but he didn't avoid it either. He allowed it to resolve itself through clarity. When challenged verbally, he didn't escalate verbally. When challenged physically, he didn't escalate physically. He reduced the problem to its core and addressed that. In this case, the core wasn't Kung Fu versus Judo. It was assumption versus timing. Bruce's own words echoed this repeatedly. He said that before you strike, you must remove doubt. And before you remove doubt, you must see clearly. Amada Injoga. Seeing clearly includes seeing when not to strike. The airport was crowded. Consequences were immediate. Control mattered. Bruce chose the smallest effective action that ended the interaction without collateral damage. That choice reflects a maturity often lost in retellings focused on dominance. As time passed, the story took on embellishments. Heights grew, speeds increased, details sharpened unnaturally. Bruce never corrected these because correcting them would have shifted focus to him rather than the lesson. The lesson was already complete. Those who needed spectacle would never be satisfied. Those who needed understanding had enough. Those who needed understanding had enough. What endures is not the takedown, but the recalibration that followed it. A man walked into an airport, convinced that one system was useless. He walked out knowing that certainty itself was the weakness. Bruce Lee didn't convert him to Kung Fu. He converted him to adaptability. That conversion changed how the man trained, taught, and spoke for the rest of his life. Bruce carried that same approach into every space he entered. He challenged stereotypes without shouting. He dissolved arrogance without humiliation. He addressed conflict without prolonging it. These patterns repeat across stories because they were patterns in his life, not isolated moments. The airport was not special. It was simply honest. In the end, 7 seconds mattered not because of speed, but because of decisiveness. Decisiveness born from clarity ends conflict quickly. Clarity born from humility prevents it from starting again. Bruce Lee lived at that intersection. He didn't need to prove Kung Fu was useful. He demonstrated that rigidity is useless, and that demonstration, delivered quietly in a crowded terminal, landed harder than any argument ever could. When the plane took off, Bruce looked out the window, already moving on, already thinking about the next refinement, the next question. He didn't carry the encounter with pride. He carried it as confirmation. Another reminder that the world tests you when you're not performing, and that the best answers are often the smallest ones. And somewhere in that airport, a man who once laughed at Kung Fu began training again. this time with fewer assumptions and more awareness. That is how lessons travel, not loudly, not instantly, but irreversibly.